He leaned across the dinner table, smirking, and said, "You actually came? Dad's gone, Delia. There's nothing here for you anymore." The room went quiet. Aunts stared at their plates. Mom didn't look up. He was so sure. And honestly, 6 months ago, he would have been right. But that was before the lawyer walked in with the envelope. "My name is Delia. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my life, I was the family's quiet disappointment. Not the dramatic kind, not the one who caused scenes or made headlines, just the one they forgot to mention. The one who got a smaller smile in the family photo and a shorter sentence at the dinner table. I work as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company. Steady work, unglamorous, practical, the kind of job nobody asks about at holidays. But my older brother Trent was always the one they asked about, the prize child, the one who could do no wrong, whose name landed differently in my parents' mouths, softer, prouder, like they were tasting something good. I left home at 24 after a falling out with my father over a man he didn't approve of. I spent the years after that rebuilding quietly, alone. I wasn't successful by their definition. No fancy title, no big house, no story worth bragging about at church. But I had something they never gave me credit for. I never stopped showing up for Dad, even when he stopped showing up for me. In his final 2 years, we found each other again, slowly, carefully. Nobody else in the family knew how deep that went, and that mattered more than any of them realized. Joel, if you've ever been the one your family underestimated, the one they wrote off while praising someone else, you already know how Delia feels. Have you ever been invisible in your own family? Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And hit. Like if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who should have believed in you first. The dinner was held 3 weeks after Dad's funeral, a formal gathering, called by the family attorney, back at the house I hadn't stepped inside in years. I drove there with the windows down because I needed the air. The house still smelled the same from the driveway. Cut grass and the faint sweetness of the rose bushes my mother planted 20 years ago and never stopped tending. Inside, it smelled like coffee and furniture polish and something heavier underneath. Grief, maybe. Or tension. It was hard to tell the difference. I hadn't even set my bag down before Aunt Rita's voice cut across the room. "Well, I'm surprised she even knows where the house is." Laughter followed. Not from everyone, but enough. Trent materialized beside me almost immediately. He handed me a printed itinerary for the evening, a formal little document with names, timings, a seat plan. I scanned it quickly. My name wasn't on it, not once. "You're a guest, Delia," he said, quietly enough to seem polite. "Act like one." I was seated at a side table, not the main family grouping, an actual side table, near the window, like I was a neighbor who'd stopped in to pay respects. The attorney, Mr. Calloway, arrived 20 minutes later. Trent greeted him at the door with a handshake and a clap on the back, comfortable, familiar. The greeting of a man who'd already had several private conversations and felt secure about how this evening would go. Mr. Calloway worked the room with careful professionalism. And then he reached me. He paused. He looked up from his paperwork, and he said quietly, "Good. I was hoping you'd make it. We need you here." Trent's smile flickered, just barely, but I caught it. That was the first crack, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Before the reading began, Trent had something to share. He'd had a display made, a framed family timeline. Photos, milestones, tributes to Dad. It leaned against the fireplace in the sitting room, and people gathered around it the way they gather around anything that tells them a story they already want to believe. I walked close enough to look. I was barely in it, the years of Sunday phone calls. But the care packages I mailed every few months. Vitamins, his favorite peppermint candies, handwritten notes because he liked handwriting better than texts. The 2 trips I made quietly, without announcing myself to anyone else in the family, just to sit with him and watch the news and eat takeout on the couch. None of it was there. Trent gave a speech. He talked about being Dad's real support system. His voice carried that particular warmth people use when they know they have the room. Family members nodded. Someone pressed a hand to their heart. I sat at my side table and listened. An aunt turned toward me mid-speech, not unkindly, and said, "Trent always knew what to do for Dad. He was just always there." She said it directly in front of me, like I wasn't someone to be careful around. Then, during dinner, Trent said it. Casually, The way you mentioned something that's already been decided. He said he'd already begun the process of transferring the family home's deed. That Dad had verbally agreed before he passed. He said it loudly to the whole table. Dad told me, "Trent, this house is yours. You kept this family together." I set down my fork. "Dad never mentioned that to me," I said. "Trent didn't even look at me directly. You weren't around, Delia. You don't know what he said." The room settled into his version of things. I went quiet, but I was watching Mr. Calloway's face. He hadn't reacted. Not once. He was waiting. Later in the hallway, Trent found me alone. His voice dropped to something almost gentle. "Look, I don't know what you're expecting tonight, but don't embarrass yourself. Dad loved you, but you know how things are." I understood the translation. Take nothing. Leave quietly. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at him for a moment. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone, Trent," I said. And I meant it. I'd spent years reacting to him. Tonight, I was done reacting. The family filtered back into the sitting room. Mr. Calloway picked up his folder. The room got quiet for the first time all evening. What they didn't know was that Dad and I had spent 18 months really talking. Every Sunday, sometimes for 2 hours. He'd call right after the morning news, and we'd go until one of us had somewhere to be. In those calls, he told me things he hadn't told anyone else. He told me he felt managed, that his schedule wasn't fully his own anymore, that certain calls didn't seem to go through, that he'd ask for his phone and find it somewhere inconvenient, or find that a conversation had already been had on his behalf before he'd had a chance to have it himself. He was sharp. People underestimated that because he moved slower in his last years, because he needed help with things. But his mind was clear. He knew exactly what was happening around him. He just needed time to do something about it. I had kept records, printed call logs, voicemails saved to cloud storage, written letters, actual paper letters that he'd mailed me because he said he trusted paper more than email. And 2 witness documents he'd asked me to hold quietly, signed with a notary present, prepared during a period when Trent believed everything was already settled in his favor. Dad was sharper than anyone gave him credit for, and he knew exactly what Trent was doing. He just needed time to make it right. Mr. T. Calloway had contacted me 6 weeks before the dinner, privately, to confirm I would attend. I told no one. I didn't come to that dinner to fight. I came because Dad asked me to. Because he'd written it all down, and he wanted me in that room when it was finally read out loud. The envelope wasn't a surprise to me. It was a promise. Mr. Calloway had served my father for over 20 years, long before Trent began inserting himself into financial conversations, before he started attending meetings he hadn't been invited to and copying himself on correspondence. Calloway knew my father's actual voice, not the version of it Trent had been performing for the family for the past several years. 6 weeks before the dinner, Calloway had called me. He explained that my father had updated his will 14 months before his death. Quietly. Deliberately, well after the period when Trent believed the important decisions had been locked in. Calloway was professional throughout our conversation. Careful, he didn't editorialize, but he had called me personally to make sure I'd be in that room. That was its own message. Now, Trent reached into the folder he'd brought and produced a document, a handwritten note, which he passed around the table with the confidence of someone who'd already rehearsed this moment many times. He described it as Dad's final wishes. Family members read it and nodded. Someone said, "Well, that settles it then." Trent leaned back in his chair. He looked across the room at me, almost sympathetically, the way you look at someone who tried and came up short. "You can contest it if you want, Delia," he said, "but it'll just drag things out." I said nothing. I looked at Mr. Calloway. He cleared his throat, set down his water glass, opened the sealed envelope. Trent had spent years building a story, but Dad had spent the last year quietly dismantling it, one legal clause at a time. Mr. Calloway began reading. The will was dated 14 months before my father's death. Formal, witnessed, notarized. His voice was steady and unhurried, and the room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen down the hall. The first revelation landed without drama, without buildup. The family home was not left to Trent. It was placed into a family trust, administered jointly. with me named as the primary trustee. Trent's chair scraped back. Wait, that can't be right. He told me. Mr. Calloway looked up. Trent, your father was very clear in his language. Would you like me to reread the section? Silence. Then Calloway continued. A letter from my father was included in the estate documents, written to be read aloud to the family. Calloway read it in full. Dad's voice in that letter was measured and precise. He acknowledged that in his final years, he had felt increasingly managed, that his access to people he loved had been quietly narrowed. He named no one. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood. He wrote that I, despite distance and old wounds, had never once tried to influence his decisions, that I had only ever listened. And then he wrote, I changed my will because I wanted it done right, and I knew Delia would do it right. Trent stood. His voice was no longer careful. She turned him against us. You all see that, right? She got in his ear. I looked at him. He called me every Sunday, Trent, I said. You could have done the same. Silence pressed into the room. Then Calloway noted, without inflection, that a separate legal file, submitted as part of the estate documentation, included a signed affidavit from my father, describing, in specific terms, attempts to limit his communications and outside contact during the final period of his life. And Trent's handwritten note, the one being passed around the table like evidence, was addressed directly in the will. Identified as not legally binding, specifically preempted. I didn't feel victorious. I felt heartbroken. Because all of it, the phone calls, the letters, the documents held quietly for a year, meant Dad had been scared, and he had trusted me to protect him when he was gone. Trent left without speaking to me. A few family members followed him out. Others stayed, sitting in their chairs, coffee growing cold, not quite sure what to do with what they'd just heard. Aunt Rita found me near the door before she left. She didn't apologize. She just stopped in front of me and said, "Your father loved you very much." I accepted it for what it was. The family home went into the trust exactly as the will specified. I didn't sell it. I arranged for it to be maintained and made available to family members who chose to treat it with respect. I didn't exclude Trent from the trust. That wasn't what Dad would have wanted, and I wasn't going to let my own anger make that decision. But Trent has no unilateral control. None. That night, after the long drive home, I sat in my car in the dark for a few minutes before going inside. And then I opened my phone and played the last voicemail my father ever left me. Saved for over a year, never deleted. I'd listened to it maybe a dozen times. He didn't leave me the house to make me rich. He left me in charge because he knew I'd protect what actually mattered, and that was never the building. Being erased by your own family, laughed at in the room where you deserved a seat, having someone stand up in front of the people who love you and rewrite your story while you sit quietly and hold the truth in your hands. If you've ever been the one they rewrote out of the story, this one's for you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to stay quiet while someone lied about you to your own family? I want to read what you went through. And click like to help this story reach others who need it. If Delia's story hit you somewhere real, don't leave yet. There are more stories on this channel from people who were counted out, pushed aside, and written off, and every single one of them found their way back. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this, share it.